Welcome to episode 136 of the Rush Roundtable. Today we're talking about track 2 off of Power Windows Grand Designs. And if you got a chance to check out the first episode for this album, The Big Money, I highly suggest watching that one. It's really good discussion on not just the lyrics but the music, and we'll kind of follow the same type of theme here. And also we're going to jump right in. We're not going to read from song by song. We're just going to jump right into the tune and discuss the lyrics and the music. So, without further ado, I'm going to read a part of the lyric and then we'll jump right into the first section. So, A to B, different degrees. So much style without substance, so much stuff without style. It's hard to recognize the real thing. It comes along once in a while. So, what can we say about that? For me, it's an interesting sort of opener. A to B is just two letters in the alphabet, but the idea of different degrees, there's not a whole lot of room in there to kind of get in there. I think that's kind of, I guess, as a way of getting into the tune for the band, it was a very sort of concise, intro. And I don't really recall hearing any tune from the guys that kind of begins in this sort of way. There are direct openings of tunes, but this one had a bit of a different flavor, at least for myself. And I guess the tag that they were going for was, I guess, talking about what was happening at the time in terms of music, in terms of my impression of what the opening part of this tune kind of discusses. So, any thoughts?
Well, the funny thing is that could be said of any era when it comes to music, as far as, what's deep, what's vacuous. I mean, certainly so much stuff without style without substance. I mean, obviously that's, it's a bit of an indictment about the poppiest of pop music, perhaps. But the thing the thing I think about is that continued to stay with me when I would think about this album and these lyrics specifically, and the idea of Neil talking about the music of the day, perhaps, is that, much like Jack Black said in the original documentary, that the true test is the test of time. And I think about the music that I disliked in 1985, and in that I would catch myself in years past, within the last decade or so, maybe listening to the radio and thinking, oh, wait, I hated that song. And it's sort of, you do find that, okay, you're a teenager and blah, blah, blah. But then years later, what remained of that perhaps vacuous music of the day? Did it actually come off as, well, this is actually pretty good when you think about it, or by certain other measures? And some of the memes that pop up on Facebook comparing lyrics by, certainly Zeppelin or Queen to some of the modern pop lyrics, that you're just looking at it thinking, okay, that's three words repeated over and over, and one of them is vulgar. But yeah, certainly Neil was looking at that aspect, which people could go back through the decades and find something without style, without substance. And then the idea of, sorry, I've been talking too much.
That's right. I mean, well, you could say, people thought that way about Elvis, that he was substance without style. And then you look back and go, well, maybe there was something there. Or when they looked at the Beatles in the 60s, when, I want to hold your hand and love me do. And the parents thought, what is this dribble? Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not Benny Goodman. But they realized later on that maybe there was something there to it. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's all in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So it is hard to recognize the real thing. But sometimes it's not always apparent at first glance. But I do want to take a step back to even before that and talk about maybe the opening, the sequencers, which, I don't know if that's Andy Richards who did that. I'm pretty sure it's probably not up Getty's alley, but how it opened up with the sequencer section, and hearing how Alex kind of works over that. It's harkens back a little to Signals, but with much better production. It's much more clear, much more treble. Um, you know, it's a bit of ska, new wave influence. I think this was really the last, probably one of the last gasps at the, the Police sort of influence on
Yeah.
Alex's guitar playing. I mean, Alex, you would know a lot more than I would about his guitar playing, but this wouldn't surprise me if the band went and said, "Okay, well, let's try to do our version of the Fabulous Men here, and
Mm.
try to do very ska or very reggae type atmospheres, but in a much faster way."
Mhm.
I think like it's kind of fascinating for me because like we kind of talked about this before we started recording. Not to date anyone here, but I am on the younger side of well, certainly of here, but also on the Rush fans page as a whole. And it's fascinating to me, like hearing you talk about the whole like how much music there was from like, let's just say 1985 when this came out, and versus how much of it is actually still like talked about. Like I have a station on my car that not it's not serious. It's just like a local radio station. It's all like 80s based things, and like that after a while you start to hear the same songs over again. Some you like, some you're like, eh. But then a while ago, I found a Instagram page just scrolling through where they will post like little bits of music videos. And I'm scrolling through, and yeah, you got like Flock of Seagulls and like big pop bands, and it'll be like 9 people in a row I never heard of, and I'll like hear it, and I like older music, so me not hearing of that was a little weird. And then I'm like, oh, that's why. Because there wasn't anything there that might have made it good as like a, oh, you just gave this to your friend, or like, oh, it's on in the car and you have a good memory for it, but not really much to it. I think not even, even outside of music, there are so many things. Like I'm a big movie fan, love movies. There's so many movies out there, most of which are okay at best. And it's the ones that like really captivate you, that have style and they have substance. There's something to them. And I think, I just shook my table. I think that is just a fascinating thing about those two lines. Like the opening bit of the song, I think really kind of hones that in perfectly. And yes, the music is good too.
Yeah, it's very interesting that even they discussed a little bit of what was happening at the time with pop music, that there were certain bands like the Talking Heads that had a subtle complexity, even though people sort of on the sort of outward appearance of a song, hearing the tune, oh, it sounds really basic, but when you really listen, you're like, oh, there's little bits and pieces in here that are a bit more arranged, and even with Rush, they were going more into the arrangement part of what they were doing, and I mean, this album really, you hear so much fantastic arrangement throughout. I mean, everything, just the choice of instrumentation, the combinations, the way things were mixed, the overall sound of this record was, so much. Like it was mentioned, brightness and sheen, and just and even some of the, even though it's kind of in the high register a little bit in terms of treble, but it was very bassy too. It just sounded very round and warm, and it just had a very, when I used to hear this with my headphones and my Walkman on my cassette, it was like, this sounds amazing. Like these particular recordings on cassette for this album in particular, just really, it just sounded so good, and that's something that was mentioned on the first episode as well, just how good this album sounds.
One
Yeah,
thing I do like, just like real quickly, even like,
Mhm.
I just want to add like the synths,
Mhm.
they really stand out, not just on the album, but especially coming right off of Big Money.
Yeah,
Like I'm very much a big fan of the way that like Rush puts their albums together.
that's important.
And like I think like coming from Big Money straight into Grand Designs, like it gets your attention. You're like, okay. And obviously once you've heard the album a million times, it's like, yay, Grand Designs. But I remember the first time I ever heard it. And I was like, I'd heard the Big Money and I've heard Marathon and maybe Mystic Rhythms, but I just like I found the album one day at a record store, said, "Oh, that's a Rush. I'm gonna buy it." Like brought it home, played it. Grand Designs starts, and I'm like, "Whoa!" And you're right, it has that very like warm, almost inviting kind of feel to it. It feels like you just want to sit down and just let it like penetrate every part of your brain.
Well, think about it. If they would have gone into, let's say, Manhattan Project
Mm.
next, it would have been like a after the up of the big money.
Yeah.
So they almost wanted to keep you at that level before taking you down a bit with Manhattan Project. So they wanted to ride that wave a little bit.
Well, it's like putting together a set list.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, the idea is you start strong, you have something that's equally strong, but maybe it wasn't something you wanted to begin with. And there was always three strong songs. Let's bring it down a little bit. Let's build it back up. And the same deal with coming up with a mixtape. Back then too. Idea is you sort of like John Cusack said in High Fidelity, you're using someone else's poetry or someone else's music to put out what you want to say. So you have to know just how to formulate these things. And right, big money, big intro, money, everyone would understand it. All right, we're talking power. Well, grand designs. Let's get into it lyrically, but also let's have that very active keyboard, just a stream of eighth notes at 140. Outlining D major. We should probably bring that up too. It's what we do here. Now, the thing I think is interesting about that is that in some ways, when I started thinking about this, and I do not mean this in any negative fashion at all, I started to think about separate ways from Journey, in so
Absolutely.
much as you have his keyboard line, which is more E minor, and then they come in with more of a chug, and I thought, interesting. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that they're copying Journey. Some of these things just happen organically. I mean, much like there's a video out there of Dennis Chambers playing a Tool song he had never heard, but he played a lot of what Danny Carey played because it was just, oh, this is what I would do here. Well, that's what a drummer would do here, especially a good drummer, So I, Rush, okay, let's come up with this keyboard line. This is pretty cool. What are we going to do? We're going to blast in with the chords this way. So just saying.
Good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So moving on to the next bit of a lyric, I'll read it to you. Like a rare and precious metal beneath a ton of rock, it takes some time and trouble to separate from the stock. You sometimes have to listen to a lot of useless talk. Shapes and forms against the norms, against the run of the mill, swimming against the stream. Life in two dimensions is a mass production scheme. So as these two sections, what can we say? For me, it's not Neil's interest in geology. I wouldn't be surprised if he had an interest in geology, but it's not about that at all. But just that imagery kind of struck me as something that you probably, if there was like a sequel to Moving Pictures, that's one thing I kind of was thinking about recently, that if there was a companion album to Moving Pictures, this one kind of has, at least for me, maybe other people might think I'm weird, but it has that sort of the imagery, the cinematic part of some of these tunes on this record. Not to bring Moving Pictures into this discussion, but just the visual component of that part of the lyric as well. I'm just thinking of this, people going out and looking through the rocks and pulling out, chiseling out all these things, and separating them out. This is a fossil. This is this type of rock. This is this kind of gem, and that sort of thing. So I had this weird sort of connective fabric to this part of the lyric, but I'm sure you guys can offer some better takes on it than myself at the moment. So what can we say?
So for me, to me, the second set of lyrics kind of corresponds with the first set. To find something, at least from a musical point of view, and especially, in 2022, there's a lot less gatekeepers. Whereas in 1985, it was easier to find music, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was good music. To go back, you had the pop hits of the day, whether it was new wave, whether it was glam metal. And then you had, Rush saying, you gotta look a little deeper, but if you look you'll find something worth looking for. And I'm thinking of bands like Talk Talk, who in '86 put out, I think it was The Color of Spring, which is one of the greatest albums of the '80s. You had, I can't think of the top of my head, but the line, you sometimes have to listen to a lot of useless talk, takes me back to the end of The Spirit of Radio.
Right.
And I want to bring up, this reminds me of a song by Kevin Gilbert from The Shaming of the True. And he's a song, where the second part is called The Dance of the A&R Man. And if you guys and gals don't know Kevin Gilbert's The Shaming of the True, you will find a lot to like. There's basically the whole album is about one kid's journey into and destruction within the record industry. And this is kind of what this mirrors a little bit, where you've got to deal with a lot of extraneous BS to try to find something worth fighting for and worth saving, whether it's musically or otherwise. So whether it's Rush, whether it's whatever it is that you're into, it may take some time. It may take some struggle. You may not get it on the first listen. I can remember when I was a kid hearing Living Colors Time's Up. I'm gonna date myself in 1990, and the first couple times going, I didn't care for it because I wanted to hear another Cult of Personality. And by the fourth or fifth listen, I got it and I dug it and I understand it. And to me, it's one of their crowning achievements. But it takes time. Any good album isn't. Yes, an album like Moving Pictures is gonna be instantaneously accessible, but some of the best albums aren't. It takes multiple listens. It takes effort. It takes sitting down either with vinyl or with CD or maybe a file and listening to it and getting it absorbed. And that takes time and that takes effort and it takes patience. And if it's good, it'll hit you. It'll hit you somewhere special, hit you somewhere magical. And my guess is that's kind of where he's coming from.
Yeah, I think like even adding on that, not even, obviously yes with music, but even like as I mentioned with that, like this is practically pretty universal. Once again, going back to movies because it's my thing. I think about Blade Runner, a movie that flopped when it first came out, like did not get good reviews. But look at it now. Just saying the name Blade Runner, you immediately are like, oh yeah, it's like one of the greatest films ever made, right? Like there's that sense of it that like, sure, first time might do nothing for you. Might change in the future though, because I think shapes and forms against the norm. That's like something might be different than what you're used to. Doesn't mean it's bad. I'm somewhere. Someone's probably not going to be the happiest with me saying that, but I'm fully into it. I'm younger. Mentioned that earlier. So when I think of like the music that gets played on like my local classic rock station, right? It's Zeppelin, Queen, like very, I think you could say sort of like mainstream rock.
Mm-hmm.
And then like when I got into Rush, it was wildly different from anything I'd ever heard before. And I think a lot of the songs that I now love, I did not like the first time I heard them because I'm like, it's too different than anything. Like, this is not something I enjoy, but I do kind of want to hear it again. I'm going to give it a second chance because they kept doing that with me, early on. This is like 2016. YYZ did nothing for me first time I ever heard it. Then I heard it again. And I was like, okay, I can hear that again. And now that I'm a bass player, it's like, it's awesome.
The gold standard.
Yeah, practically, So I think there definitely is something to be said, yes, for things that are like come out and they're smash hit immediately. But we have the term cult classic for a reason.
Yeah. Some of this stuff makes me think of what Zappa famously said about the cigar chomping businessmen, in that the idea was that these guys of an older generation who are in the record company, they're thinking, well, I don't know what's cool. I don't know what these kids are into, so they'll sign anyone and accidentally sign someone good. Whereas the guys who were the generation of the bands were, well, you're not hip enough. That band's not cool. So they and obviously the music industry for a long time has been very derivative. You look at the 80s metal, which for any of the people who are not around in the 80s, the term hair metal wasn't around in the 80s because everyone had big hair. I just had fluffy hair. But it was the sort of thing where, what bands stood out? Who was the derivative? Who were the bands that really lasted? I mean, Def Leppard clearly lasted. They're on tour right now. Dokken was a big one. certain bands fell by the wayside. Bullet Boys, who's thinking of the Bullet Boys? So, and not that I'm trying to disparage the Bullet Boys or promote Dokken, but I'm just saying that when I think of bands from that era, and you just think, well, some bands did seem more derivative than others. Some bands did seem like maybe they had a little something. They might have really sounded like everyone else, but there was just something there, And I obviously with Dokken, George Lynch went on with he remained in the 90s as a name, separate from them. So there was just that little bit of something. But I suppose I'll turn it back to Rush instead of talking about 80s metal. I'll let Rob turn it back.
But it kind of all comes back to, at the end of the day, there's got to be something that you got to go through all the fluff, and you got to go through all the extraneous nonsense to get to what is, to get to what you need, to find something that's different, to find that, separates it, separates it from the norm, to take it back to vital signs, to go through all the shit and find what you're into. So whether it's, Rush, or whether it's, Talk, or whether it's, The Cure, it's finding the band that was worth diving into, at least at that time.
Yeah, and they did the same thing as a band. They went to see different bands when they came to town. If they had a night off, they go see King Crimson, or they go see the Talking Heads, or whoever they could go and see the Police, Grateful Dead, whoever it was. They did the exact same thing that we just talked about. They were seeking new sounds. They were seeking, to kind of take what they were doing and really lift it, to separate themselves out from the stock of what was happening musically, for sure. And on that note, we can continue on to the next part. But excellent points all around. Okay, so here we are at so much poison in power, the principles get left out. So much mind on the matter, the spirit gets forgotten about. Like a righteous inspiration, overlooked in haste, like a teardrop in the ocean, a diamond in the waste. Some world views are spacious, and some are merely spaced. So yes, we're getting a bit deeper into the power sort of component of this, and this was talked about on The Big Money, and we just kind of alluded to it in the previous set. Now we're getting to a bit more nitty gritty. So what can we say about this section?
Well, and those first two lines really are kind of what I was mentioning, really, the idea of the A&R people who are the gatekeepers. And the idea that the principles get left out, is this art or is this commerce? Well, for them, it's commerce. I mean, also with the Crimson reference, I mean, Robert Fripp has certainly said, if your aim is music, don't get into the music industry. Find a decent job, play music, because if you're in the music industry, your aim is really going to have to be business. So, and then that's too easy for the individuals with the power, with the money, with the say, to leave out those principles, which is clearly what Rush was encountering, even though 2112 kind of ostensibly had hands off, because these guys clearly knew what they were doing. I'm sure various people still tried to grab at what they could take from a successful band.
I think it does also, kind of going back real quick to like the power thing you brought up, like the use of power. I mean, obviously the album's called Power Windows, kind of on the money there, but I think it is like interesting to think, you always hear this, this phrase. It's pretty much a trope in screenwriting, as like, the kind little businessman who, wants to do good, and then a little bit of money comes that way, they get some power, and they get corrupt. And I think everything I've heard about the music industry literally says that if you are a nice person, if you are like, truly like, no, I'm not going to do wrong whatsoever, you don't really get hurt. Like, you don't really get hurt from as much as the people who are like, no, you're going to do this way, whether good and bad, obviously. Sometimes things are like, maybe that worked out okay. Maybe person's just a horrible human being, you know. And also, you know, I think it's just, you know, coming back again to the, you know, teardrop in the ocean, you know,
Mhm.
diamond in the waste, you know. There's always, you know, something a little bit different going on in a large scale form, you know. What's the what's that phrase that dumpster divers always use? It's like one man's trash is another man's
Oh,
treasure.
Right.
That one.
Hmm.
I have a friend who says that like every 3 days, it seems like.
every time
But
thrown out of a dumpster.
I don't ever question what my friends do. I just let them be.
Yeah,
I
it's
think I
safe.
think yeah, it is definitely interesting hearing, you know, hearing in those two sections, you know, you have the use of power, but then you also have like, you know, kind of what we were talking about earlier, the thing that, you know, needs to just find its right moment to unveil itself to people, for people to be like, oh no, that's really, it's really nice. I think it's just a fascinating section.
I do want to harken back to so much mind on the matter, the spirit gets forgotten about. That automatically takes me back to the spirit of radio, and I almost think that was on purpose, where you know, the last few lines of the spirit of radio, you know, uh, that it almost kind of echoes back to that a little, almost like a wordplay. Like, see, we didn't forget to, the spirit of the music does forget and it does get forgotten about, because you've got the A&R men, you've got the people who make it all about the commerce, make it all about the business, and it's no longer about the music.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting bit of wordplay that I believe at least he did.
And even like going back to me continuously using movie references for some apparent reason, I think you hear the same thing about movie producers all the
Oh
time.
yeah.
Like I think of David Lynch when he was making Dune. Like he had a movie, and the movie that got released was not the movie that he made, not the movie he wrote, because the producers came along and said, well, you're making that movie. We want Star Wars. Which I could go on a whole rant about how Dune cannot be Star Wars, but that is not for this podcast.
Right.
Um, but I just think it's like, it's interesting, that thing of like, you know, yeah, could do that, but will that make us money? And how for some people that gets in the way of someone's art.
Well, your example of Blade Runner really is a good one, in that you had like 5 different releases of Blade Runner, because you had the theatrical release, which I saw in the theater as a kid, and I had the voiceover, so it was meant to be an overt film noir, because clearly the they didn't really know what to do with it. They sort of said, well, Ridley Scott wants this, but we don't think it'll work, so we're going to have Harrison Ford do a voiceover, which I actually have a copy of that on like a VHS tape that I taped off HBO in the 80s, sitting around somewhere. But then, okay, now here's Ridley Scott's version. All right, it's a little different. We get rid of the voiceover, and then we have the final cut and all these other arrangements of it, just because it was the artist versus the studio. And in some cases, I can give some credit to producers and studios to say, well, this guy shot, like with Lawrence of Arabia, I can't remember how many hours of film was shot, but the idea is, no, we're not going to, like Patton Oswalt, I think he had a bit about it. No, we're not going to release an 11-hour movie. So they have to bring in the editors just to cut them down and make sense of it.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, it's art as expression, not as market campaigns. A little bit of shades to natural science, and
Exactly.
also at the end now we're actually getting to the end of the lyric set. Against the run of the mill, static as it seems, we break the surface tension with our wild kinetic dreams, curves and lines of grand designs. And one thing that was mentioned in the Big Money episode is this sort of is this a chorus? This could be kind of a chorus. I think it was kind of a chorus was the term that was used. And now we're bringing back this idea of the mill. Again, that sort of symbol of power, right? we're kind of we're running into some interference. So it kind of brings back all these points that we just talked about. You know, you have a dream, but then you have the tension of the mill, and you have to kind of work your way through that. You know, you have to kind of bend, you know, curves and lines, getting to what you want. You know, going around, going in a straight line. And the design of that is quite grand. You have to really, you know, sort of push yourself and try to escape the clutch, you know. And this happens in classical music as well. Bach encountered this with the church. He had a lot of interference with them, and he had to design the music in such a way to get around all that. So, so the theme of that sort of working or the workaround of music with bands and people trying to put out art and express themselves, it's interesting and something I didn't catch on to when I first heard this record when it came out. And as the years go on, you start appreciating more and more of these things, and you start sifting out, as it was mentioned earlier, you know, sort of going through the stock and pulling out these little things that sometimes you miss in the very beginning with hearing a song like this. And as Goji mentioned too, and we've all mentioned, that sort of different sound we're hearing from the band, you know, and catching these things, you know, is always interesting. And it seems like through the years it happens more often. I don't know if you guys feel the same in that regard.
I do. I mean, a few things that I think we need to mention. You know, obviously, you know, we want to mention, I think Neil's idea for this whole song. And that was kind of taken from John Dos Passos, and I'm sure I'm destroying that name. But his novel entitled The Grand Designs. And, you know, that book is about the critique of FDR's New Deal, and was extremely critical of bureaucracy and big government regarding the New Deal. So obviously, Neil's lyrics describe that frustration in a little more of a personal way. But I think, you know, the last two lines, you know, we break the surface tension with our wild kinetic dreams, try to want to, you know, get past that. Okay, how can we make it better for us? You know, yes, there's all this extraneous noise. How can we move past it? How can we move forward as individuals? It almost goes back to the individual versus society, or in this sense, individual versus government. You know, but saying it in a much different, much more artistic way that perhaps he was able to do 10 years ago, which I think is pretty cool. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, actually, also that to me that ties into what Rob mentioned about Bach, is that was always kind of the gamble, the juggle, the game that anyone involved with the arts had to have to continue the patronage. So if you were the jester for the king, you kind of find a way to work in your jokes at the king's expense, but that won't get you killed. Or, you know, Bach, he's writing for different churches. You know, he was writing for the Catholic Church, I think, quite a bit, and he wasn't Catholic, but it was the sort of thing where, okay, what can I do? These guys don't want this, they want that, okay. And yeah, with Neil, the idea of a writer once said to me, the writers love puns. And I thought, Neil does work in puns, and obviously there are the cheesy puns, and then there are the well done puns. And at the end of it, curves and lines of grand designs. I mean, you think grand designs, you think visual design. Perhaps most people probably would, and curves and lines themselves certainly would be an integral aspect of visual designs. But of course, he's talking about music. But like we're doing, it could be music, it could be movies, it could be visuals, it could be and even just a critique of society. And oddly enough, too, Dos Passos had the book The Big Money, that was only related to the big money in title alone. But yeah, you figured Neil would have been looking at grand design in a kind of a post Ayn Rand mentality.
Yeah, I think even like it could also mean just sort of like a general plan and an idea. You know, like I almost think about it as like this is a horrible example, but it's the only one I can give right now. It's like when you're trying to throw a surprise party for a friend, and you're trying to like get them to like egg them on into like this direction.
Mm.
It might seem like you're doing is like it's a bit weird, and then through the grand scope of it, they're like, oh, hey, we're doing this for you, like big thing. Adding into that, might seem weird now. Give it like an hour. Like your opinion might change on it a little bit.
It'll all make sense in the end.
It's almost like fun and positive manipulation.
Yeah. And I think like obviously music, movies, like throughout all that, everything seems like I heard an interview just today of Nick Castle, the actor who originally played Michael Myers in the first Halloween. He was like in the scene where he picks the guy up, stabs him in the kitchen, leaves him there, and just the head tilt.
Spoilers.
Like John Carpenter was literally like yelling at him on camera. It's like, tilt your head to the left, slowly. Now back to the right. Now walk away. And Nick Castle was like, what are you making me do here, John? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Then he saw the dailies the next day and said,
yeah,
I get it. So I think there is always that sense of like, what seems crazy now might be, like a revolutionary idea, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, might just become the norm and everyone might just get used to it. So I think, I'm probably going way more existential here than needed, but I think like that is an interesting way to look at the song.
Yeah,
and it's personally the way I look at this part is on a grand scale, not just on like one project, although it can still be applied.
Yeah, it applies to this album for sure. I mean, yeah, it was such a different sound compared to their previous records, but if you stuck in long enough to get to Power Windows, they're going to go in different directions, and it's that thing where over time you go, okay, oh yeah, you may not have liked the record maybe on the first listen through, and we covered this in this discussion, or even something you haven't heard in a long time with regards to Power Windows. So if you feel that maybe you haven't got enough love for Power Windows, you definitely should go back and have another listen. I think you'll be as your ear ages, you might appreciate this album even more, as I do, as well as we all do. And I think even on that note, this could be a good way to close on this discussion. So give yourself another run through of Power Windows. You'll be happy you did. And if you got a chance to check out the first episode, if you didn't get a chance to check it out, I would recommend going and checking out the Big Money episode of the Rush Roundtable. So I guess on that note, we can call it. And I'm glad you tuned in. And if you like the channel, please feel free to like and subscribe. And we will call it on that. Thank you so much for coming by. We'll talk to you real soon. Take care.